Hello, and welcome to Module 2. Module 2 is going to cover the first three chapters in the Logic of American Politics text. You're going to have three chapters that you're going to be responsible for, chapters 1, 2, and 3. I would pay particular attention to the key terms for each of those chapters, but I would note that there are slides, and I have created voiceover slides for each of those three chapters. So if you wish to, and I strongly encourage you to, you should listen to those presentations. You could imagine them almost as though they were class sessions where I covered the material. Typically I cover those first three chapters one day each. The videos probably take a little over an hour to watch in total. But the more time you put into it, probably the more helpful it will be. The quiz that you're going to have is going to cover each of the three chapters, and then there's going to be a discussion. The discussion is going to deal with the prisoner's dilemma, which is a concept from chapter 1. I strongly encourage you to pay attention to the prisoner's dilemma, the corresponding video and such, so that you are prepared to write a good essay on that. The next thing that I would like to address is that I strongly encourage students in this class to keep track of the key terms that are at the end of each chapter. Now, there'll be voiceover slides for each of the chapters. However, sometimes we will have questions that are just from the key terms. Sometimes we will have questions that are just from the slides. You will note that in chapter 2, we actually see a segment called the 5 Powers of the President. I believe that's slide 3 in chapter 2, but if that's not correct, I'm sorry. I just tried to recollect that. But there is a slide that says Powers of the President. It's under Article 2, and what you'll see is the 5 powers of the president listed. Now, the book actually talks about the powers of the president as being divided into his powers as head of state versus his powers as head of government. Now, I read a book by Ken Coleman several years back related to the powers of the president. He divided them up into 5 separate powers, and I found that to be much superior, because if when you look at the president's powers of head of state versus his powers of head of government, it sort of assumes an understanding of the way that European political systems are organized, where there's a recognition that in parliamentary democracies that the prime minister is just the head of the government, but that the ceremonial responsibilities of state both exist and are held either by a monarch or by an elected president who's not powerful on a day-to-day basis, but who has certain responsibilities for the management of the country, but not of the governmental decision-making process. And I thought, who cares about that if you're learning American government? But if you look at American government, one of our defining characteristics is the president as the leader of the executive branch, as someone who interacts with the judicial and legislative branch, and a person who's commander of the military and in charge of American diplomacy. And so Coleman's 5 different powers of the president seems to be more useful to an American student of American government. And so I encourage you to pay attention to those slides. That's off the top of my head the primary example of value added in chapter 2. Chapter 1 actually talks a good deal about the chicken game as a counterpoint to the prisoner's dilemma. And the chicken game and the prisoner's dilemma are very similar concepts in terms of collective action problems. But the prisoner's dilemma has the advantage of having one sure, most likely outcome, whereas the chicken game the metaphor for the chicken game, or the story of the chicken game, is the two people driving their cars directly at each other on an old highway in 1950s America. Well, the other uh, high school students look on in horror, and the guy either swerves out of the way and loses his car, and his girlfriend doesn't respect him, or he keeps going straight and he causes a horrible accident, or the other guy swerves out of the way and he's the big hero. Well, you know, that can be applied to many ideas in American politics, most specifically the idea of whether or not you're going to join in any organization that's trying to make social and political change. If you were to join an interest group, you would have to do a lot of work, or you'd have to pay a lot of money. And your goal as a free rider, as a person who doesn't contribute but benefits, is to not do that. And so what are you trying to do? You try very hard to not do what you're supposed to shirk your responsibilities, and yet to still benefit. And so as long as you think that somebody else is going to be doing the work, you're happy to not do the work. However, the moment that you decide that somebody isn't going to do the work, then you have to rush to complete the task. And the only real danger is that nobody will do what they're supposed to, which in fact then does happen sometimes. And it's the equivalent of the two cars crashing together in the chicken game. Now, the book compares that to the prisoner's dilemma, and the prisoner's dilemma is very useful for looking at a political figure who has an incentive to look after his best interests. But if each politician looked after his best interest rather than the collective interest of the country, then the next politician knows, you know, if a bill's not going to pass, then you're not going to cast a tough vote for it. If a vote's not going to fail, you're not going to cast a tough vote against it. That's why there's very few closely divided votes, at least very few votes that are closely divided amongst members of a political party, because they know that they need to work together. And the prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of, you know, if you work together, then you get the bill passed. If you don't, if you just do what your constituency wants, or you badmouth anybody's effort to accomplish anything controversial, you get good press, but you don't necessarily get government business done. So those are slightly different types of collective action problems. And so the chicken game is introduced here, whereas it's not introduced as quite as much in the book. It's, I think, alluded to, but it's not actually talked about the way the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons is. In any case, I do not believe there's any similar concept from Chapter 3, except that we do talk about the different provisions of the Constitution that tend toward giving the states power versus the provisions of the Constitution that give the national government its power. So good luck, everyone, and if you have any questions, I strongly encourage you to contact me.